I was 24 when I moved into a basement apartment in Brooklyn. This was summer of 2017, and I'd just started my first job in the city. The rent was surprisingly cheap for the neighborhood, which should have been my first warning. The landlord said the previous tenant had broken their lease early due to personal reasons, and he needed to fill it quickly. I was desperate for affordable housing and didn't ask too many questions. The apartment was a garden-level unit in an old brownstone. You accessed it through a separate entrance, with stairs leading down from the street. It was dark, only 2 small windows near the ceiling that let in limited natural light. But it was clean, recently renovated, and the price was right. I signed the lease that week and moved in immediately. The first night, I noticed the temperature. The apartment was cold. Not just cool, but genuinely cold. Even though it was July and sweltering outside, I checked the thermostat. It was set to 72, and the air conditioning wasn't even running. Yet my breath was visible in the bedroom. I could see it condensing in the air. In summer, in a heated apartment, I called the landlord the next morning. He sent a maintenance person who checked the heating system, the insulation, everything. They found nothing wrong. The temperature readings showed 72 degrees, but I was wearing a winter jacket inside my apartment in July. The maintenance person looked confused, said the equipment was working fine, and left. I thought maybe I was just adjusting to the new space, that my body would acclimate, but it got worse. The second night, around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps walking across my living room floor. I lived alone. I froze in bed, listening. The footsteps walked from one side of the living room to the other, then stopped. Silence. My heart was pounding. I waited, listening. Nothing more. I convinced myself it was the upstairs neighbors. That sound traveled strangely in old buildings. But I lived in a basement. The footsteps were in my apartment, not above it, and they were too close, too clear. The next night, same time, the footsteps returned. Same pattern, walking across the living room, stopping, silence. This time I got up, turned on all the lights, searched the apartment. Nobody there. All doors and windows locked from inside. I was alone, but the footsteps had been real. I'd heard them clearly. The fourth night, I set up my phone to record audio while I slept. When I listened to the playback the next morning, I could hear it. At exactly 3:14 a.m., clear footsteps, not muffled or distant, right there in my apartment. Walking, stopping, then silence. The recording confirmed I wasn't imagining it. Something was walking through my apartment every night at the same time. I started researching the building. I found old newspaper articles in the library archives. In 1987, 30 years before I moved in, a woman had died in that basement apartment. She'd fallen down the interior stairs, connecting the basement to the main house, stairs that had been sealed off during renovations. Her body had been found 3 days later. The fall had killed her instantly. The article said it happened around 3 in the morning. She'd been walking to her kitchen when she fell. I felt sick reading this. The footsteps I was hearing, the same time every night, were following the path from what used to be those stairs to where the kitchen had been, the exact route she would have walked. The sealed-off stairwell was now behind my bedroom closet wall. The footsteps started there, walked across what was now my living room, and stopped where the old kitchen had been, now part of my bathroom. I couldn't prove anything paranormal, but I also couldn't explain the footsteps. They were consistent, timed, following a specific path that aligned perfectly with the apartment's old layout and a death that occurred there decades ago. I tried to rationalize it. Old buildings settling, pipes expanding, something logical. But it didn't sound like building noises. It sounded like footsteps, human footsteps, walking the same route every single night at the exact time of a fatal accident. Then other things started happening. Objects would move, not while I was watching, but I'd leave something in one place and find it in another. My keys on the kitchen counter would be on the coffee table. A book on my nightstand would be on the floor across the room. My coffee mug would move from where I'd left it to a different spot entirely. Every morning, something new. I set up a camera, night vision, motion activated, pointing at my living room. I wanted to catch whatever was moving my things. The first night of recording, I reviewed the footage. At 3:14 a.m., right when the footsteps occurred, the camera glitched. The timestamp jumped from 3:13 to 3:15, 2 minutes just missing. Every night after, same thing. The camera would malfunction during those exact 2 minutes. The footage would corrupt, or the battery would die despite being fully charged, or the file would be empty. I tried different cameras, different positions, same result. Whatever was happening at 3:14 a.m. didn't want to be recorded. Technology failed consistently during those specific minutes. My phone would die if I tried to use it then. My laptop would crash. The lights would flicker and dim. Everything electronic would malfunction for exactly 2 minutes, then return to normal. I started sleeping with lights on, but that didn't stop it. The footsteps continued, objects kept moving, and the temperature stayed unnaturally cold, my breath visible, even in midsummer. I'd wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, not at 3:14 but random times, and feel like someone was in the room with me. Not see anyone, not hear anything specific, just feel a presence. The air would get heavier, pressing down on me. The temperature would drop even further. My skin would crawl with the sensation of being watched. One night, I woke up and couldn't move. Sleep paralysis, I told myself. I'd experienced it before, but this was different. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even open my eyes fully, but I could feel someone standing at the foot of my bed. I could feel them there. The weight of their presence, the change in air pressure, the cold intensifying around my feet, where they were standing. I tried to scream but couldn't, tried to move but was frozen. This lasted maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. Then suddenly I could move again, gasped for air, turned on the light. Nobody there. But the foot of my bed was ice cold to touch. I lasted 3 months in that apartment. 3 months of nightly footsteps, moving objects, equipment failures, unexplained cold, and the overwhelming feeling of sharing my space with something I couldn't see but could definitely feel. I broke my lease, paid the penalty, and moved out. The landlord wasn't surprised. He didn't even argue about the early termination fee. He just said he'd start looking for a new tenant. I later learned that I was the 7th tenant in 3 years to break that lease early. The landlord kept the rent cheap because nobody stayed. Everyone left within 3 to 4 months, always with the same vague complaints. Personal reasons. The apartment didn't work out. Nobody wanted to say they were being driven out by something they couldn't explain or prove. But we all knew. We'd all experienced the same phenomena. The footsteps at 3:14 a.m., the impossible cold, the objects moving, the feeling of being watched by something invisible. I'm 29 now. 5 years have passed since I lived in that basement apartment. I still think about those 3 months. About lying in bed, hearing footsteps walk through my home every night. About the woman who died there, walking to her kitchen in the middle of the night, 30 years ago. About how death leaves an imprint on a place, a pattern that repeats endlessly. The footsteps weren't trying to scare me. They were just repeating what happened, over and over. A recording of a moment played back every night at the same time, not haunting with intention, just echoing through time. And that somehow made it worse, because it meant it would never stop. Those footsteps would walk through that apartment every night at 3:14 a.m., forever, whether anyone was there to hear them or not. I was 28 and working as a sound engineer in Nashville. This was fall of 2019, and I'd just been hired by a small independent recording studio. The studio was in an old converted church from the 1920s. Beautiful architecture, with amazing acoustics. That's why they'd chosen the location. The space had been renovated into recording booths, control rooms, and equipment storage, but the original church structure remained mostly intact. My first week was normal. I worked mostly day shifts, recording local bands, mixing tracks, standard studio work. But after my second week, they asked if I could take some overnight shifts. A major artist wanted to book the space for night sessions, and they needed an engineer. The pay was significantly higher for overnight work, so I agreed. My first night shift started at 10 p.m. and ran until 6 a.m. The artist and their team showed up around 11. We got set up. Everything went smoothly. They worked until about 4 a.m., then took a break. I stayed in the control room, organizing files and cleaning up the session. That's when I heard it. Music, coming from somewhere in the building. Faint, but definitely music. Hymn-like, multiple voices singing together. I thought maybe the artist team had put on some reference track in another room. I went to check. The main recording room was empty. So were the vocal booths. The lounge was empty. The music continued, but I couldn't locate the source. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I went back to the control room. The artist and their team returned from their break. I asked if they'd heard music. They looked at me confused, said no. We continued the session. The music had stopped. I convinced myself it had been something from outside, maybe a late-night church service somewhere nearby, sound carrying strangely through the old building. But it happened again my next night shift. Same time, around 4 a.m. The studio was empty except for me, just doing some mixing work alone. The music started. Hymns, multiple voices, organ accompaniment, but muffled and distant, like it was coming from very far away or from another time. I walked through the entire building, trying to find the source. Nothing. Every room was empty and silent. Yet, I could still hear the music throughout the building. I checked all the equipment. Nothing was playing. All the speakers were off. All the computers were either shut down or showing silent waveforms. The music wasn't coming from any device in the studio, but it was there. I could hear it clearly. I started recording on my phone, trying to capture it. When I played back the recording, there was nothing, just silence. But I could hear the music in real time, while the recording captured nothing. I mentioned it to the studio manager. He got quiet, then admitted that others had reported hearing music late at night. He said the building had been a functioning church until the early 2000s. The congregation had shrunk over the years until they could no longer afford to maintain the building. It had sat empty for almost a decade before being bought and converted into the studio. Some of the older staff claimed to still hear church services sometimes, especially late at night. I thought it was suggestion, people hearing what they expected to hear in an old church. But the experiences continued. The music always started around 4 a.m. Always hymns, always unrecordable. And it wasn't just music. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps in the halls when I was alone in the building. Heavy footsteps, like dress shoes, on the original hardwood floors that had been preserved from the church. I'd go look, and nobody would be there. But the footsteps would continue, walking down hallways, up the stairs to the old choir loft, through rooms. Then the equipment problems started. During night sessions, gear would malfunction. Not broken, just refusing to work properly. Microphones would cut out for no reason. Recording, software would crash. Cables would need to be reconnected multiple times per session. The equipment would test fine beforehand and work perfectly during day shifts. But at night, especially after midnight, everything became unreliable. One night, I was alone editing a session when all the lights went out. Complete darkness. The emergency lighting didn't come on. I used my phone flashlight to navigate to the circuit breaker. Everything was in the correct position. I flipped them anyway, and the lights came back on. As I walked back to the control room, I heard a door close upstairs. The old choir loft. Nobody was supposed to be up there. It wasn't part of the active studio space, just storage now. I went up to check. The door to the choir loft was closed. I opened it and looked inside. Empty, dusty, clearly hadn't been used in a long time. But the door had closed. I'd heard it clearly, a heavy wooden door with old hinges that made a distinctive sound. It had closed while I was standing at the circuit breaker. I was alone in the building. Doors don't close themselves. I started asking older staff members about the church's history. One of them, who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades, told me about a tragedy that occurred in the early 1992, a fire during a Sunday service. The fire department responded quickly, and everyone evacuated safely. But the church's longtime organist had gone back inside to try to save the organ, a historic instrument donated by the original congregation in the 1920. He died in the fire. The organ was destroyed, The church rebuilt but never fully recovered, eventually leading to its closure years later. The staff member said the organist had been obsessive about that organ, spending hours practicing late at night, sometimes staying until 4 or 5 in the morning. He'd recorded several albums of hymns played on that instrument. The staff member said sometimes they still heard organ music in the building, always around 4 a.m. Always hymns, always coming from where the sanctuary had been, where our main recording room now stood. I researched the fire, found newspaper articles confirming the story, found the organist's name, found his recordings online. When I listened to them, I recognized the hymns. They were the same ones I'd been hearing at 4 a.m., the same arrangements, the same style. But the recordings were from the 1,980 seconds, and the organ had been destroyed in the 1,990 seconds. Yet I was hearing those same arrangements in 2019. I started noticing patterns. The music, the footsteps, the equipment failures, they all intensified on certain dates, Sundays especially. The building remembered its schedule. It remembered when services used to be held. The equipment problems were worse on Sunday nights after midnight. The footsteps and music were more frequent and louder. The church was maintaining its schedule decades after it stopped being a church. One night, around 4:15 a.m., I was in the main recording room, adjusting some microphones. I heard the door close behind me. I turned around. The door was closed. I'd left it open. I walked over and tried the handle. It wouldn't turn. The door was locked from outside, but I was inside, alone, and that door didn't have a lock that could trap someone inside. You could always open it from the interior, yet it wouldn't budge. I was locked in the recording room. I called out, thinking maybe someone had come in without me noticing. No answer. I tried the door again. Still locked. I pulled harder. Nothing. My phone had no signal in the recording room. The walls were too thick. I was trapped. The temperature dropped suddenly. My breath became visible. The lights flickered, and I heard the organ. Clear and loud now, not muffled or distant. Right there in the room with me. A hymn, played on an organ that didn't exist anymore, by someone who'd been dead for 30 years. I don't know how long I was locked in that room. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The organ music continued, surrounding me, coming from everywhere. Then suddenly, the door clicked. I tried the handle, and it opened easily. I left the room, left the building, went home. I called in sick the next night, told the studio manager I couldn't do night shifts anymore. He understood more than I expected. Said I wasn't the first to request day shifts, only after experiencing the late night phenomena. The studio still operates. They still book night sessions. They warn new engineers that the building has quirks, and some people find overnight work uncomfortable, but they don't explain why. They let people discover it themselves. Most just think it's an old building with strange acoustics and temperamental equipment. Some realize there's more to it and request schedule changes. A few quit entirely. I still work there, but only day shifts. The building is completely normal during daylight hours. No unexplained music, no footsteps, no equipment failures, no locked doors. Whatever presence remains from the church only manifests late at night, maintaining the schedule it kept for decades. The organist still practicing his hymns around 4 a.m. The congregation still arriving on Sunday nights. The building still functioning as a church, invisible and unrecordable, overlapping with its current purpose as a studio. I'm 32 now. 3 years have passed since my first night shift there. I still hear those hymns sometimes in my head, especially around 4 in the morning. I learned that buildings remember. They hold on to their history, their purpose, their tragedies. You can renovate the structure, change its function, fill it with new people and new equipment. But underneath, the old purpose remains. The old schedule continues. The organist who died trying to save his instrument still plays it every night, in a space that exists alongside ours but just out of sync. You can't record it. You can't photograph it. But you can hear it. You can feel to it. And if you're there at the right time, in the wrong place, you might get locked in with it, trapped between what the building is now and what it used to be. And those are the longest minutes of your life. I was 31 when my husband and I bought our first house. This was spring of 2021, and we'd been searching for months for something in our budget. The house we found was in a quiet suburb outside Philadelphia. It was a 1,960 seconds ranch-style home, needed some cosmetic updates but was structurally sound. The previous owners had died, elderly couple, and their children were selling the estate. The price was reasonable, the location was perfect, and the inspection came back clean. We closed in April and moved in immediately. The first week felt like every other moving experience. Unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, learning the quirks of a new space. But then we started noticing the sounds. At first, we thought it was just the house settling. Old homes make noise, but these weren't random creaks and groans. They were specific sounds, at specific times, following patterns. Every morning at 6:37 a.m., we'd hear the coffee maker in the kitchen turn on. Not actually turn on, the machine was unplugged, but we'd hear the sound of a coffee maker brewing. That distinctive, percolating gurgle, the drip of water into a pot, the heating element warming up. The sound would last exactly 4 minutes, then stop. The coffee maker sat silent and unplugged on the counter, but the sound happened every single morning at 6:37. Every evening at 5:43 p.m., we'd hear the garage door open. The mechanical grinding of the door motor, the chain pulling, the door rolling up. But when we'd check, the garage door was closed. It hadn't moved, yet we'd both heard it clearly. 5:43, every evening without fail. The garage door sound, followed by footsteps in the garage. Then the door from the garage to the kitchen would sound like it was opening and closing. But it wasn't. It would remain closed, locked from our side. At 8:11 p.m. every night, we'd hear the television turn on in the living room. Not our television. A different sound, older, like a CRT, television, from decades ago warming up. That electrical hum, the static burst as the picture tube activated, then voices. Muffled conversation, like dialogue from a show, but we could never make out words. It would continue for exactly 53 minutes, then silence. Our modern flat screen would sit dark and off, while these sounds played through the room. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe sound was carrying from neighbors, but we checked. The nearest neighbor was far enough away that we couldn't hear anything from their house normally. Maybe residual audio from electromagnetic interference. We had the electrical system checked. Nothing unusual. The sounds persisted, predictable as clockwork, every single day. My husband started keeping a log. He documented every sound, the exact time it occurred, how long it lasted. After 2 weeks, we had undeniable patterns. 23 distinct sounds occurring at specific times daily. The coffee maker at 6:37 a.m., the garage door at 5:43 p.m., the television at 8:11 p.m., a shower running at 10:15 p.m. even though both bathrooms were dry, a door closing upstairs at 11:42 p.m. even though all doors remained open, footsteps walking the same route through the house at 7:23 a.m. every morning. We researched the previous owners. The couple had lived in the house for 48 years before they both passed within months of each other. We contacted their children, asked about their parents' routines. The son told us his father had been obsessive about schedules. Woke at 6:35 every morning, made coffee, left for work at 5:45. Came home at 5:43, parked in the garage, came inside, watched the evening news at 8:15, took a shower at 10:15, went to bed at 11:45. Every day, same schedule, for decades. The times didn't match exactly. Our clocks were a few minutes off their clocks, but the pattern aligned perfectly. We were hearing the echo of their daily routine. The house was replaying 48 years of the same schedule. The sounds weren't random. They were a recording of life, imprinted on the space through sheer repetition. But it wasn't just sounds. Objects would be moved. Not while we watched, but we'd leave something in one place and find it in another. A coffee mug on the kitchen counter would be in the sink. The remote control on the coffee table would be on the side table. Books on the shelf would be rearranged. Always small changes, but consistent. The house was maintaining its own organization, the way it had been organized for decades. We'd adjust the thermostat to 72 degrees. By morning, it would be set to 68. We'd set it back to 72. The next morning, 68 again. The previous owner had preferred 68. The house remembered. We'd leave the kitchen curtains open. They'd be closed the next morning. The previous owners had closed them every night. The house maintained their preferences. Then the dreams started. Both of us, independently, having the same dreams, walking through the house, but it was furnished differently. Older furniture, different wall colors, shag carpeting instead of the hardwood we'd had installed. In the dreams, we'd see the elderly couple. Not clearly, just shapes moving through rooms, sitting in chairs that weren't there anymore, watching a television we'd removed. The dreams felt like memories, but they weren't ours. We were experiencing the house's memories. One night, I woke up at 2:17 a.m. My husband was still asleep beside me. I heard talking downstairs. Quiet conversation. Two voices, one male and one female. I thought maybe we'd left the TV on. I went downstairs. Everything was dark and off, but the voices continued, coming from the living room. An elderly couple's voices, discussing mundane things. What to have for breakfast tomorrow, whether it might rain, when their son was supposed to visit. Next, I stood in the dark living room, listening to this conversation. It wasn't coming from any device. It was coming from the space itself, the air, the walls. The house was playing back conversations that had occurred in that room thousands of times over 48 years. I wasn't hearing ghosts. I was hearing an audio imprint, a resonance that remained after the people were gone. I woke my husband and brought him downstairs. He heard it too. We stood together in the dark, listening to a conversation between people who'd been dead for over a year, their voices preserved in the space where they'd lived their entire married life. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes, then faded to silence. We went back to bed. It happened again the next night at the same time, and the night after that, we tried recording it. Like with the other sounds, our recordings captured nothing. Whatever was happening existed in a way that technology couldn't process. We could hear it, feel it, experience it, but couldn't prove it existed to anyone else. The house was playing back its history to us, but only to us, only while we were present and listening. The final proof came when we found an old photo album the estate sellers had missed, tucked in the back of a closet. Photos of the previous owners throughout the decades they'd lived there. One photo was dated and time-stamped, the 12th of June 1987, 5:43 p.m. It showed the husband pulling into the garage, the door open behind him, the time we heard the garage door every evening. Another photo, the 3rd of March 1995, 6:37 a.m. The wife in the kitchen, making coffee. The exact time we heard the coffee maker every morning. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was saturated with life. Decades of routine, repeated so consistently that it had soaked into the structure itself. The sounds, the moved objects, the temperature adjustments, they weren't paranormal in the traditional sense. They were imprints, echoes. The house remembering what it had been, unable to adjust to what it was now. We still live here. We've been here 4 years now. The phenomena continue. Every morning, 6:37, the coffee maker sounds. Every evening, 5:43, the garage door. Every night, 8:11, the television. We've stopped trying to change it. We've learned to live alongside it. The house keeps the schedule it kept for 48 years, and we've adapted our lives around it. It's not threatening. It's not malicious. It's just persistent. Sometimes I think about the couple who lived here before us, how their entire adult lives were spent in these rooms, how every day they followed the same routines, walked the same paths, sat in the same chairs, how that consistency, that devotion to schedule, imprinted itself so deeply on this space that it continues even after they're gone. Their lives were so regular, so disciplined, that the house learned them, and now it can't forget. I'm 35 now. 4 years have passed since we moved into this house. People ask if it bothers us, living with constant reminders of the previous owners. I tell them you get used to it. And we have. The sounds are comforting now, in a way. We know when the coffee maker will brew. We know when the garage door will open. We know when the TV will turn on. There's a predictability to it. A ghost schedule that we've incorporated into our lives. But sometimes, late at night, I think about what will happen when we're gone. When we've lived here for decades, following our own routines. Will the house remember us too? Will future owners hear our sounds at specific times? Will they find us imprinted in the walls, the floors, the air? Will we become the echo that won't fade, the schedule that won't change? Because I've learned that houses remember, and some memories are permanent, not because they're supernatural, but because they're so deeply ingrained that they become part of the structure itself. Life leaves marks, routine leaves grooves, and some buildings never forget the people who turn them into homes.